nugget, the first of a series of 2 on project time management, we will focus on schedule definition, the activities associated with preparing the project schedule. This covers activity definition, taking the WBS initially defined during scope management and breaking it down to a further level of detail where single activities, single tasks can be assigned to single individuals. We'll focus on developing the project sequence, which tasks must be completed first, which are predecessors, which are successors on the overall project plan. We will focus on understanding what resources will be required to complete our project. We will focus on the specific activity duration estimates. How long will it take to complete each component of our project schedule? And finally, we will talk about specific activities related to developing the project schedule, getting the complete activity list, sequence, resource estimates into a project scheduling tool to develop the project plan. And that will complete this nugget on project schedule development. In the next nugget, we will focus on project schedule control. Although it may appear overwhelming to have 5 separate components related to project schedule development, it actually isn't that bad. The PMBOK defines, and in reality you will find, that many times on smaller, simpler projects, activity definition, sequencing, resource estimating, duration estimating, and schedule development will happen concurrently. You will not be conscious of doing a separate activity for definition versus sequencing versus estimating versus development. And in fact, on many small projects, these 5 components will be done concurrently with developing the work breakdown structure as part of scope definition. We have broken them down here in these nuggets, as well as the PMBOK guide have broken them down separately to ensure that you're aware of the specific requirements to do good activity definition, to do good activity sequencing, resource estimating, duration estimating, and schedule development appropriately. It's important that you're aware of these separate activity steps as part of overall project management, and it's critical that you're aware of these separate activity steps to pass your PMP exam. But the key, when you're developing an actual project plan to deliver a project, be aware that you're covering the intent of each of these, but don't focus exclusively on saying, I am now doing activity sequencing. As I mentioned, especially on smaller, simpler projects, you will be doing these 5 things concurrently, and you won't be aware of a separate, specific thought process for sequencing versus estimating versus duration. The first step in project schedule definition, as defined in the PMBOK guide, is activity definition. Essentially, activity definition is documenting the work to be performed. Activity definition is going to start where creating the WBS in scope definition stopped. Activity definition takes the WBS, which was deliverable based, and turns it into a WBS, or an activity definition, that is work or schedule based. What do we mean by that? Basically, we're going to have one WBS element to one resource. Whereas a deliverable-based WBS could have multiple resources. You could have 3 or 4 or 5 analysts assigned to a task to define, understand the current situation. A activity-based WBS would break that down where each resource would be assigned to each component, a unique component of the WBS. So effectively, activity definition is a further decomposition of the original WBS that you created during scope definition to document the specific work to be performed, where you're going to have one WBS element assigned to one resource. It's important that you take the work that is work or schedule based as opposed to the higher level deliverable based. As mentioned in the introduction to this nugget, this step may not be required, or this step may not be explicitly defined if, for instance, the deliverable-based WBS was refined at a sufficient level of detail that, in fact, the rule of one WBS element to one resource has already been applied. So again, don't get hung up on making sure that you're saying, oh, I am now focused on doing activity definition. Get focused on ensuring that you have one WBS element, a task, an activity in your work plan at a sufficient level of detail that the work will be completed by a single resource in a meaningful period of time. Now there is one exception to that, and that's when you consider the rolling wave planning process. So if we look at rolling wave planning, we have our overall project objective, where we're going to go through an analysis phase, a design phase, and a development phase. When we do the initial project plan development, we may only be doing the analysis phase at the detailed work level. So you have task 1, task 2, task 3, specifically defined using activity definition at the unit of work where you have the one resource to one WBS element. For the design phase, you may be able to get away with saying, here is deliverable 1, here's deliverable 2, here's deliverable 3. And at the development phase, you simply have a high-level definition that says development is going to be 100 person-hours of effort, or whatever the case is going to be. So in a rolling wave planning process, initially you develop the detailed activity definition for the immediate phase of the project you're going to undertake. You can leave the next phase out at a higher level of work definition at the deliverable WBS element, and subsequent farther out components for your work breakdown structure you can leave at a much higher level of definition. As analysis completes, you go in and you do your rolling wave application, where you then take the deliverable-based WBS for design and you start to define the WBS elements for it at the task 5, task 6, task 7 level related to deliverable 1, and subsequently for deliverable 2, deliverable 3. And your development estimates, you will start to break down that for development we will have development deliverable 5, deliverable 6, and so on. And this is your rolling wave. As design completes, you would then do your further work breakdown definition for the development tasks. Doing rolling wave planning is a very effective way to develop good, solid project plans. Before analysis has started, you really don't have sufficient detail to allow you to define what are the tasks that are going to be required to produce each and every deliverable for a design, because you don't know what the design is going to be, because analysis is going to be done. And if you don't know what design details are going to be, you certainly do not have enough information to define at any level of granularity, even to the deliverable level, what the final products of development are going to be. So with rolling wave, you can focus on ensuring you have the proper WBS elements, the proper activity elements defined to ensure that analysis is successfully completed. Then based on that, you can start to develop further detailed estimates for design and so on. The one issue with rolling wave planning is senior management and the business are going to say, well, it's fine for you to tell me that analysis is going to be 250 person hours or 250 person days worth of effort. I want to know what the total project is going to be. And that's why you need to get into the rolling wave, where you do a higher level definition of planning for design and even a higher level definition of planning for development, so that you can say, based on the information I have currently at hand, analysis will be 250 person hours. Based on this, I think design will be 175, and based on this, development will be 200, so the total project effort will be such and such. But you need to ensure when presenting that total project effort, that 525 number, that you're presenting it in a way that people understand that there's a degree of imprecision, that there's a degree of flexibility in that when you're presenting the information, you're defining that it's plus or minus a certain percentage, plus or minus 75%. When you're doing rolling wave, it's important that you're presenting the definition that the total project definition, the total project size, has been estimated, and you have a certain degree of confidence, potentially not high, because we're simply doing a very high-level cast of what our further out phases are going to be. And as you refine this, the design may not be 175. The design may, in fact, become 225 based on the detailed estimates. And based on that, you're able to refine that says development will not be 100. Based on this information, development is going to now be 150. Or maybe we should become more optimistic and say, based on this, development is going to be shorter and will only be 75. So when you use a rolling wave planning process, it's important that you define your level of confidence that when you're presenting the total project picture back to senior management, back to your business sponsor, they understand that this is not a firm, fixed estimate for the total project. It's simply a firm, fixed estimate for the next phase for your rolling wave, and best assumptions, and I'm going to use the term best guesses, for the further out phases for your project, and you're going to present your level of confidence. The next step in project schedule development is the definition of the activity sequencing. In other words, defining the dependencies between the tasks, identifying any dependencies that one task has on the other. Dependencies can be set up with four main types, with the most common being finish start. Finish start, simply applied, means that task B cannot start until task A has finished. Hence the link, hence the dependencies from A's finish to B's start. Used most commonly, probably 95% or better of all dependencies created in a project plan will be a finish start type. Other types of dependencies are finish, where we're saying task B cannot finish until task A finishes. Often used where you have a series of tasks that will finish and result in the combination of a milestone for a phase or component for your project, where the final tasks for the phase would have a finish-finish relationship on the milestone itself. A similar style of dependency is a start-start, where you're saying B cannot start until A starts. Similar application, except in this instance it would be the tasks are dependent on the start of a phase, the start of a milestone, and the subsequent tasks can start once the phase or once the milestone has been initiated. A final type of dependency is start-finish, not commonly used, and therefore will not be discussed further in this nugget. The most common style of dependency is finish-start and will be used most times in creating a project plan. When you're creating your project dependencies, you need to ensure you're focusing on the mandatory dependencies. The dependencies that absolutely impact the outcome of the project, or the dependencies that absolutely determine that B absolutely cannot start until A has been completed. B is dependent on some output, B is dependent on some process, B is dependent on some information that A is going to be provided, and therefore B cannot start until A completes. Often people will put optional dependencies into the project plan as well, simply saying, although it's not critical that B finishes before A, it would be ideal, or it would make more sense, or maybe B is being completed by the same resource as A, so therefore B shouldn't be started until A has completed that. Avoid, where possible, putting optional dependencies into your project plan. Optional dependencies simply create a more complex dependency diagram. Optional dependencies, as a result, therefore require more work by you to create the dependencies, and more importantly, optional dependencies add more complication and result in more effort to debug and to maintain the dependency plan for your project. So focus on the dependencies and absolutely define the mandatory dependencies into your project plan, whether a finish-start type, finish-finish type, or start-start type. A final aspect towards dependencies is you may want to put in leads or lags. And basically a lead or lag saying A and B are dependent on each other, but I have a lead of 2 days. So A is a predecessor to B, finish-start relationship, but I'm allowing B to start 2 days before A finishes, which means there's a lead on B being able to start early. A lag is just the opposite. A and a lag of 2 days, meaning that B cannot start until 2 days after A is completed. A is the completion of a deliverable, and the lag is the acceptance process for the deliverable to be accepted before B, the next activity, can be initiated. So work on the dependencies, ensure you have the right dependencies created for your project plan, and that only the mandatory dependencies are created will result in the simplest, easiest project dependency diagram for you to debug. What is a dependency diagram? There are two types of dependency diagrams. Activity on node is the most commonly used. is the type of dependency diagram that will be used by project scheduling software. And a second type of dependency diagram sometimes used, often in academic explanations of dependency process, is an activity on Arrow. We will look at both of these dependency diagrams in just one moment. One comment on dependency diagrams and creating of dependency diagrams. As an active project manager delivering projects, using a tool like Microsoft Project, which we'll be examining in part of this series, you do not need to create dependency diagrams. Your software will create the dependency diagrams for you. You simply define the dependency types, define that to your project software, and the project software itself will create the dependency diagrams. I've included the details of the dependency diagrams in this nugget, as it's important that you understand these dependency diagrams, how they work, as there will be questions for you on the PMP exam directly related to dependency diagrams. So let's have a look at the most common style of a dependency diagram, the activity on node. The activity on node, or often referred to as the precedence diagram, consists of the identification of each activity, each task in your schedule, in this case tasks 1 through 5, defining them on the nodes, and then using lines or arrows to link them. So in this case we're saying task 1 has a successor task of task 2 and task 4. Task 2 has a successor task of task 3, and task 5 has predecessors of 4 and 3. This is depicting the most common style of finish start, but if appropriate, you could say this is a start-start and this is a finish-finish type of dependency within your activity on node dependency diagram. Again, activity on node, the most common. Activity on node is what your project scheduling software will draw for you, often called the dependency diagram. Each activity, each task in your project is identified as a node, the box, and the dependencies between the nodes, between the activities, identify the actual dependencies, where 1 to 2 has a finish-start relationship, where 3 to 5 has a finish-finish relationship, and 4 to 5 has a start-start relationship. This allows you to understand the dependency diagram. This will be examined and reviewed on the PMP, so it's important that you understand what an activity on node is, how the activities are represented, and how the dependencies are represented. This is quite different than the next style of activity diagram we're going to look at, which is the activity on Arrow. The activity on Arrow dependency diagram, by contrast, puts the activities on the arrows. So in this case, again, we have activities 1 through 5. We see the activity on the arrow with these null nodes. There's no value, there's no information within the nodes. They're simply there to allow us to connect and create dependencies. So in this case, 2 and 3 are dependent on 1. Then we have 4 is dependent on 3, and we sometimes have to create these dummy dependencies that's going to allow 2 to have a dependency on the end of the project or default through activity 5. So the dotted line on an activity on Arrow is referenced to as a dummy activity and is there to ensure that 2 has a relationship with the end of the project. Activity on Arrow only represent finish to start style relationships. An activity on Arrow has no capability of representing a finish-finish or a start-start relationship. The activities are on the arrow, dummy tasks are inserted, and the nodes are simply connection points that allow us to understand the relationship between activity 3 and activity 4, and in this case the dummy relationship to allow us to understand the relationship between activity 2 and activity 4 going through to activity 5. Again, it's important to understand the distinction between the activity on node and the activity on arrow, as this information will be on the PMP exam and you will be required to display understanding of these diagramming techniques. Although in practice you will never create manual diagrams, they will be created for you by your project scheduling software. The next step in schedule development is activity resource estimating. In other words, understanding what resources, the quantities of the resources, and when the resources are needed. When I think about activity resource estimating, I think of goods, I think of supplies, I think of materials. For example, let's take the example of building a home. So what resources? We're going to need 2x4 wood. We may need some 2x10 wood. We will need shingles. We will need drywall, etc., etc. These are the goods. These are the supplies, the materials. So this is the definition of what the resources are required. The quantities of resources, we can go to our blueprint, we can read our blueprint, and we can determine that we need 300 2x4s. We can read the blueprint, and we can determine that we need 150 2x10s. We can look at the blueprint and determine we need 5,000 shingles. We can look at the blueprint and determine that we need 175 sheets of drywall. So we're determining the quantities of the resources required. And finally, we determine when they're needed. Not when they're needed in terms of the calendar, but when they're needed in terms of the work breakdown structure. Which work breakdown structure elements? So it's construct the walls. It's construct the second floor. It's obviously put on the roof. And it's install drywall. So activity resource definition is all about understanding what goods, what supplies, what materials are required to allow you to execute your project plan. You need 2x4s, you need 2x10s, you need shingles, you need drywall. This information can be determined from the project scope, in this case from our project blueprint. You determine the quantities, again from the project scope, from the project blueprint, and you determine when the resources are needed based on the work breakdown structure elements that have been defined for your project. The next step in project schedule development is activity duration estimating. In other words, identifying the amount of work that is required to complete the project. Unlike resource estimating was focused on the goods, the services, and materials, the duration estimating is focused on the team. The amount of work the team must put in to each work breakdown structure element to allow the project to complete. You need to focus on the work, the actual effort, not the duration. To define this, let's assume we have a work breakdown structure element that requires 40 hours of work. If you assume 40 hours of work is equivalent to a single work week, you may or may not be accurate. 40 hours of work may be completed faster than a work week or may take longer than a work week depending on how the team is assigned to the work breakdown structure element. If you assigned the 40-hour work element to a single resource, and that resource is full-time on your project, it will be completed in 1 week. But if you assign that 40-hour work breakdown structure element to 2 resources, it will be completed in 2.5 days. Or if you assign that 40 hours of work to someone who's only available to your project half-time, so you have a half of a resource, the work will not be completed for 2 weeks. So activity duration estimating is focused on identifying the amount of work required to complete the project elements, not the duration. If you focus on the work, it's 40 hours of focused work, and then assign the appropriate resources to the work breakdown structure element. Is it 1 resource? The project scheduling software will determine that task can be done in a week. Is it 2 resources? The software will determine that it can be done in 2.5 days. Or if it's only half of a resource, the software will determine that it's going to take a total of 2 weeks to complete the assignment. So that's what activity duration estimating is all about. Identifying the work, developing estimates for the work, not the duration, and letting the project software calculate the duration for you based on the availability of the resources to work on your project. In spite of what I just said about a single resource being assigned to that 40-hour task, being able to complete it in 1 week, that actually is not the case. Here I've made a very interesting statement where I say 40 hours does not equal 40 hours. Or in other words, you need to ensure you're assigning the tasks, you're developing the estimates based on actual resource availability. So you have a full-time resource, and your company works a 40-hour work week. In that case, why does a full-time resource working a 40-hour work week not be able to complete 40 hours of work? Simply because that full-time resource is going to get sick occasionally. That full-time resource is going to take a non-project time to read email, for example. That full-time resource is going to take annual vacation. That full-time resource is going to attend departmental meetings. That full-time resource is going to meet with fellow peers to discuss a problem on the last project that they worked on. So even if it's a full-time resource assigned to no other responsibilities in your project, and that full-time resource is working a 40-hour work week, I would suggest that 40 hours is not available to work on your project. You need to factor in time over the 6 months or the 8 months or the 10 months or the 2 years that this full-time resource is going to be working on your project. They're going to get sick. They're going to take time every morning and every afternoon to read their email. They're going to take their annual 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of vacation allotted to them every year. They're going to attend departmental meetings. So 40 hours does not equal 40 hours. What's the right number? Does 40 hours equal 35? Does 40 hours equal 32 and a half? Does 40 hours equal 30? Unfortunately, I can't tell you what that right number is. That right number is going to depend on the length of your project. If it's a 2-week project, if it's a 4-week project, you probably will have minimal impact to sick time. Likely, hopefully, a 2-week, 4-week project, the resource will not get sick, and therefore the number is closer to 40. During that 2-week, 4-week window, the resource will probably take some time to read email, so therefore if it's not 40, it may be 39 or 38. If it's a 2-week, 4-week project, the resource will probably definitely not be taking vacation, and you may know there's no departmental meetings coming up during the duration of the time that resource is working on your project. So maybe a higher number, maybe 35 is the appropriate number for short assignments. But if the assignment is longer, if the resource is going to be on your project for 6 months or even 12 months, there's going to be some sick time. There will definitely be vacation time. There will probably almost definitely be departmental meetings. So what are these going to average out to? How much vacation time do you have to plan for? What is your company policy on sick time? Maybe 40 is closer to 32 and a half. Maybe 40 is closer to 30. You need to determine the likelihood of impact for things like sick time, for vacation, for departmental meetings, for other company responsibilities, and determine what an appropriate resource availability is going to be, and include that consideration when you're determining project estimates and when you're determining how resources are going to be assigned to your project. Because 40 hours of resource availability does not equal 40 hours of project work completed. A final component that must be addressed for resource estimating is the actual estimate yourself. How do you develop good, solid, realistic estimates? How do you know it's going to take 40 hours or 20 hours or 60 hours to complete a specific work breakdown structure assignment. I hate to say it, but sometimes estimating is a guess. It's a rolling of the dice. It's a random number. I don't suggest that's a good method, but sometimes it really is. It's never been done before. Projects are unique. Therefore, you have never undertaken a specific task like this. So maybe it's a guess. I hope it's not as random as rolling of the dice or generating of a random number, but sometimes estimating is purely guess. An estimate is an estimate. Hopefully your estimating can be a little more concrete than that. It may be analogous. It may be same as. The last time we did a project like this, or the last time I worked on a task like this, it took me 25 hours. So therefore, using this estimating technique, this project should also take 25 hours. It may be parameter driven. The last time we developed a X, it took us 6 hours. Therefore, we're developing 5 X's times 6 hours, so the estimate is going to be 30. So you may have a series of specific parameters based on units of predefined measure, and you simply multiply the number of parameters on that. But estimating is estimating, whether it is a guess, and I hope you don't have to resort to that method very often, whether you're using some form of analogous same as estimating process, whether you're using some form of parameter-driven process, you want to ensure your estimates are as realistic as possible. Ideally, you would use multiple estimators. You would ask 2 or 3 or 4 people to say, go away and develop estimates for these work breakdown structure elements. Go away and develop estimates for this component for my project plan, and then come back and compare and rationalize and develop sound estimates based on the results from multiple estimators. Use an estimating technique such as multiple estimators is expensive in the amount of time and the amount of effort it requires to use multiple estimators. A technique often used in lieu of multiple estimators is a technique called the PERT. And PERT applies the principle of multiple estimators, and you simply develop multiple estimates. So you yourself or your estimator develop multiple estimates for each task. You develop a pessimistic, a optimistic, and a most likely. And then using the PERT formula, which is simply the pessimistic plus 4 times the most likely plus the optimistic, divide that by 6, will be your actual project estimate. So using the PERT technique, pessimistic. If everything was awful, if everything fell apart, if nothing worked on my project, it's going to take 10 days or 10 hours or 10 units to develop this work breakdown structure, to complete this work breakdown structure element. If this were an average project and everything went reasonably well, it would probably take me 6 hours, so it's 4 times 6. And if this were the perfect project, if I had absolutely no challenges, I could complete this in 5 hours. So you do that over 6. So it's 10 plus 24 plus 5 over 6, or 39 over 6. And I don't have the mental math in my head for 39 over 6, but the division of 39 divided by 6 would be the final estimate that you would use for your project based on the PERT technique. So estimating, they are guesses, but develop processes that you can develop good, solid, realistic estimates that will identify the work that is required to complete each and every element of your project work breakdown structure. The final step in project schedule development is the actual development of the schedule. It's taken the WBS elements that we've identified and worked on in this nugget. It's taken the dependencies that we've identified and worked on in this nugget, and it's taken the estimates and combining them together to create the project schedule. It's identifying when each unit of work will be completed based on the dependencies and the estimates and the resources assigned to the work breakdown structure element, and developing the schedule. You do this using software. Using a product like Microsoft Project, which we'll be demoing later in this series, you will take the information, plug it into your software, and the software itself will develop the schedule. It sounds easy. It is relatively easy. The key thing being the first cut at the schedule, based on the WBS elements, based on the dependencies, based on the estimates, will probably not be the final schedule that you will deliver to your project sponsor. You need to be prepared to reiterate. Developing a good project schedule requires many iterations. 2, 3, 4 iterations will be required to develop a good project schedule. You will look at the dependencies, you will change the dependencies. You will look at the estimates to determine if the estimates are realistic. You will look at the resource assignments to determine if different resources can be assigned to different work breakdown structure elements to deliver a schedule that is more aggressive, to deliver a schedule that is more resource balanced. You need to be prepared to iterate to develop the final schedule, which will then be presented to your project sponsor. This concludes our first of 2 nuggets on project time management. In this nugget, we looked at activity definition, understanding the work breakdown structure elements that are required for the unit of work that's going to be required to complete all project activities. We looked at activity sequencing, understanding the successor-predecessor relationships, understanding the dependencies and defining the dependencies in our work breakdown structure. We looked at activity resource estimating, understanding what resources, what materials, what supplies, what quantity, and when they are required to allow our project to deliver. We looked at activity duration estimating, determining solid, realistic estimates for the work that is required to complete our project. And we took all of the information, our WBS, our dependencies, and our estimates, talked about putting that into a piece of software such as Microsoft Project to develop the realistic schedule that the project is going to be approved and delivered based on. In the next nugget, we will look at the issues around schedule control. This concludes our nugget on project schedule definition. I hope this video has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.